Hello everyone, Randy here for another Shop Basics here with R.D. Allen, and this time around we're doing something not quite so basic. We're welding. In this case we're actually going to be MIG welding, or since I don't have gas, we'll be calling it flux core wire welding. We'll be using shielded wire, which will provide the gas for us. So to get started here, we're going to need a couple things first. If you're going to be welding, obviously you need a welder. In this case, like I said, we're going to be MIG welding, and I'm going to be using the 4NA 190 MP. It's a combination TIG, MIG, and stick. So in this case, we're going to select the MIG mode. We're using synergical mode, meaning this controls both my wire feed and the amperage, which is kind of nice. The one next to it here, this is a much cheaper welder from Harbor Freight. Actually works fairly well. A little bit more manual there. You got your amperage and then your wire feed. Nothing else really particularly fancy about that. So obviously a welder. Next, you're going to need some welding gloves. Very important. You're also going to want a welding helmet. In this case, I prefer auto darkening. Makes it much easier, in my opinion, to see what you're going to be welding, especially if you're doing stick welding. You know, MIG welding, maybe not quite as important, but stick welding, you know, you can definitely see where you are stick welding, or where you're going to be starting to weld anyway. Obviously, once you start welding, the auto darkening, you know, probably not quite as important. But when you start, I definitely like the auto darkening, so that's my preference. Again, auto darkening is going to cost you more, but in the long run, I like it. And next, you're going to want some sort of long sleeve welding jacket, whatever your preference. Basically, any exposed skin is going to get burnt, basically sunburnt. So basically, like standing out in the sun too long, welding is going to do the same thing to you. That's the reason for the welding helmet, by the way. Hard on your eyes, and basically do the same thing to your skin as, you know, standing out looking at the sun. You know, basically get a nice sun tan out of it, and you probably don't want that. I know I have a habit of, I've just got short sleeves on, putting my welding gloves on, and the welding gloves come up to about here, so I've got about this much area of exposed skin, and I'll get a nice funny sunburn right there because of that. So if you don't want that, make sure your welding jacket, long sleeves, make sure nothing flammable, because the sparks will be hot and it will set something on fire if it is flammable. So if you've never welded before, what I recommend doing, getting yourself some scrap steel here. And I've just pulled up a few scrap pieces here. And basically what we're going to do, we're just going to run some beads of weld. We're not necessarily going to try to weld anything together at this point. Just run some beads of weld along some steel. Get yourself some practice. Next, for setting up the welder. In this case, like I said, I'm using no gas. We're using shielded wire. So we need to make sure the welder's set up properly. And typically with that type of wire, you're going to want to switch your welder, depending on how it came. You're going to want this to be negative. So your wire feed will be negative, and your ground clamp will be positive. So we'll actually just turn it on. Well, actually, let me wait just a minute here to turn it on, because this welder is quite loud. Next thing you want to do is set your amperages and whatever settings the wire needs for what you're welding. In this case, I've got about looks like about 1/8 of an inch piece selected here. And this particular welder has it written on the side of the panel here. So 1/8 of an inch using flux core. Using, let's see what's here. We need to have flux core wire, so 1/8 of an inch. We're going to set this to 37, and that one will be at 66 about. So we should be good with that, setting it at 37. So that's what we'll do. And again, for referencing that, just check what the manual for your welder says. That's probably the best way to get started. You know, once you get a little more practice, you can kind of feel it a little bit. And okay, I need to turn it up, turn it down a little bit. Okay, so we'll fire up the welder here. And like I said, the ground clamp here, when welding with no gas on the MIG welder, this is positive. So not really a ground clamp if it's positive, but you get the idea. So let me set these other pieces off to the side here. And we're just going to take this piece here, and to get started, we're just going to run some beads of weld along it. And basic welding, nice, slow, easy. And you're basically just going to stitch back and forth. So, welding helmet, gloves, and this is a steel plate here, by the way. And steel on top of it, it should make good contact. Normally you'd want the ground clamp actually attached to it, but to make it easier here on myself, I've got it attached to that, and that should work quite well. And like I said, any exposed skin, make sure you cover it up. Otherwise you will regret it. This is just another welding jacket here, by the way. Okay, I think we're ready to weld here. And just one thing I want to make note of before we start welding, make sure your contact in here is good. Wires protruding out about that far, so ideally you don't want the ball on the end. That would be less than ideal. We might just cut that off here in a moment. Especially if you're starting to weld, maybe a pair of wire clippers handy might be a good idea, because you'll probably be cutting this off quite frequently, especially when you first start. Okay, so we got our wire welder set up here, set at 66 like it said on the chart here. 38, which it said 37, so 38 should be close enough. Got welding gloves on, helmet is on, grounding clamp connected. We got the torch ready to go. And again, when you're wire welding, usually they have a trigger on them so you can start and stop the weld. That, in my opinion, is what makes wire welding just a little bit easier than stick welding. So I think we're ready to get started here. One thing I will make note of, ventilation. I do have a fan going there just to blow the fumes away. That might be a good idea if you're going to, especially doing some longer welds. Okay, so let's get started here. And one thing I kind of noticed right off, it's sparking a little bit. Sounds like we don't quite have enough voltage there, so we're going to turn that up just a little bit there, maybe 42 it says. We'll try that. And like I say, we're basically just going to be slowly going back and forth. Obviously, we're not actually welding anything together here. And again, like I said, when you're starting welding, just pick a nice piece of scrap steel here and just test on it. There we go, just like that. You notice how we kind of got the nice smooth sound once we got it going there. That's something where once you get a little practice and experience, you can kind of adjust the setting there a little bit for whatever you think it needs. And now we just need to wait for this to cool down. And while that's happening, perfect time to talk about surface prep. Probably arguably the more important part of welding maybe. And that is making sure your material you're about to weld is prepared properly. So if you're welding two pieces together, you probably want to put a 45-degree bevel on them, so you can really fill that in good with weld. In the case of this piece, which it's a little warm, so okay, I'm not going to bother touching it. Let's say you were going to weld this here. You probably won't have to put a bevel on this because it's already room there. But if you're going to join two pieces together, let's say we take these two pieces here and you're going to weld those together, you'd want to put a 45 on each piece. Also, you want to make sure they're nice and clean. This piece is quite rusty. The cleaner it is, the better it's going to weld, the easier it's going to weld as well. Okay, so that's probably about cooled down. Two other pieces you're probably going to want, in addition to the welder and all this other stuff: brush and a chipping hammer. So you can see the slag on there. We'll just chip that off. And you probably should wear safety glasses for this. I'll just take it easy so it don't go flying all over. And there we go, we got ourselves a weld. Okay, and there's the piece we welded. Doesn't look too bad. And like I said, you'll basically just have to try it a few times, nice and slow, and just stitch your way back and forth a little bit, especially of course when you're welding two pieces together. Obviously with something like this, not quite as important because you're not really welding anything together, just practicing. And like I said, that's in my opinion the best way to start. Just get yourself a nice chunk of steel like this, and once you get a nice bead going on here, you should be able to weld a bead between two pieces. A couple of other tips here as well. You can use your other hand to kind of hold yourself. Oop, just hit the button there. And you can kind of use your other hand to support your both hands. So use this hand. I'm welding right-handed here. You can use your right hand, lay it on top of your left hand to kind of support yourself with welding. That might make it a little bit steadier for yourself, especially for me anyway. My hands aren't necessarily the most steady here when welding. so it helps if I use my other hand to steady this hand. The next thing, there's kind of two ways you can weld with this. You can pull the weld, which is what I was doing, meaning I start here, I'm going to work my way this way towards myself, or you can push the weld. So you're going to push into it and I'm going to work away from myself. So welding like that. Personally, I find it easier just to pull it towards myself. Pushing away is supposed to give yourself better penetration when wire welding though, so that's the reason for that. But like I said, I usually just pull. It gives myself much better and easier to weld. So if you're just getting started, probably the way to go, just pull it towards yourself. Once you feel like you got that, then maybe you can start pushing away from yourself, pushing the weld. And again, like I said, nice, slow, and steady. So basically, if we're going to weld these two pieces together, hop up to this piece a little bit, go down to that piece. Basically zigzag back and forth. And nice, slow, steady motion. And again, you're listening for a nice, smooth arc as well. And, you know, if it's popping and sizzling and missing, you probably either need to turn it up, turn it down, something like that. Adjust your settings a little bit. You know, turn up your wire feed, turn down your wire feed. It all depends on what your welder is set up to. In this case, the 4NA is nice because it has synergic mode. So the amperage and the wire feed are basically synchronized together. So when I turn one up, it turns both of them up, which works out really nice that way for this welder. The Harbor Freight welder there, a little bit more complicated. Like I said, it's wire feed and then your amperage, or voltage, I guess you could really say, voltage. And they're both independently adjustable. And again, for settings, check the manual that came with your welder. That's going to be the best recommendation I can give you for that. All welders are probably going to be a little bit different, you know, especially this one to that one, completely different. Okay, folks, so that I think we'll wrap up the video here. Again, just a quick recap. Obviously, if you're wire welding, you're going to need a MIG welder, wire welder. Again, I'm not using gas, using flux core wire. It goes by a couple different names, but usually they call it flux core. And in this case, I've got a larger reel of welding wire on this one. These are the smaller, was it 2 pound, I think? Yes, these are the 2 pound rolls. This one has, I think it's a 10 pound roll, I believe they call it. And like I said, using 30 thousandths diameter flux core in both of these welders here. Next, you're going to want a pair of welding gloves, very important. Again, in any open, exposed flesh, eyes, etc. Basically look like you get a sunburn out of it. Welding helmet, also very important. Again, you don't have to have auto darkening, just my preference. I like the auto darkening welding helmets. Just makes it much easier to weld in my opinion. You know, basically when you start the arc, it darkens. When you're done welding, it finishes and the helmet lightens back up, which is kind of nice. Next, you want to make sure you're wearing long sleeves, long pants, you're fully covered. You know, welding jacket if you need one, welding apron, even a hat, a welding hat if you need that as well. Again, depends what position you're welding in and all that good stuff. All very important. PPE, personal protective equipment, very important when welding. And then like I said as well, I know I've mentioned this a couple times now, as far as settings for your welder, just check your manual. That's the best place to start. Once you start there, then you can go from there. And then to start welding, just pick yourself a nice piece of steel, get some nice scrap steel, make sure it's clean. If you're welding it together, bevel the edges, and then just start laying weld down. Just find some pieces you can practice on. Don't start with something that needs to be welded first. Start with something you can practice on. And then of course there's all kinds of online videos, websites that can help you improve your welding. Basically just nice and slow, back and forth. Depending on your setting too, maybe you have to go a little bit faster. Basically watch the weld puddle with your helmet there. If you see it's getting too big, you need to go a little faster. If it's not a nice smooth weld puddle, you probably need to go slower. And at least when I started welding too, that was always my biggest problem. Make sure you go slow enough. I think the tendency is to go too fast right away. Just nice, slow, and steady. So anyway, folks, I think that will wrap up the video here again. Another one of the shop basics. And again, this is not really a very basic topic. I tried to cover it as basically as I could and simply as I could. And of course, if you have any other suggestions you'd like to see as well for shop basics, be sure to let me know. Leave them in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching and until next time.